History often turns on moments that seem inevitable only in hindsight. But imagine, for a moment, a world where the unthinkable happened, where the map of North America split not through slow political evolution, but by fire, iron, and the desperate gamble of a young republic. In this what-if story, we step into an alternate civil war, a version of events where small twists of fate, a handful of decisions, and a few lives not lost reshape the destiny of a continent. Now, what would it have taken for the Confederacy, outmanned, outproduced, and surrounded, to break free and survive? Let's make one thing absolutely clear from the start. On the battlefield alone, the Confederacy was never destined to defeat the Union. No roster of brilliant Southern commanders could overcome the North's overwhelming industrial power, larger population, and, perhaps most importantly, Scott's Anaconda Plan slowly strangling the South. Given enough time, the Union was always going to grind its enemy down. But one narrow path to an independent Confederacy did exist, long before musket smoke filled the air. If Southern politicians in Washington had managed to divert far more federal arms and supplies to Dixie armories before secession, they might have tipped the odds. And when the Southern delegates gathered at Montgomery, they made a surprising choice: Jefferson Davis. Flawed, stubborn, and deeply distrustful, he was far from a perfect leader, yet he became the Confederacy's first president. His early cabinet helped stabilize the fledgling nation, and the war's opening months seemed promising. The Confederates seized Fort Sumter under P.G.T. Beauregard, and as Lincoln demanded more troops, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina followed the Deep South out of the Union. Beauregard then delivered another victory at Manassas, until Davis, afraid of the general's rising influence, removed him from the Virginia theater and sent him west. There, Beauregard served under General Albert Sidney Johnston, the highest-ranking officer on either side of the war. Johnston had fought in the Black Hawk War, the Texas Revolution, the Mexican-American War, and countless frontier conflicts. At Shiloh, the bold Confederates caught Ulysses S. Grant completely off guard, and in this alternate timeline, Johnston does not bleed to death after falling from his horse. Instead, he presses the attack, delivering a devastating blow that shatters Grant's reputation. The future Union hero retreats in disgrace and is dismissed, destroying the career of the man who historically masterminded Northern victory. Momentum shifts. Confederate forces push northward, defeating retreating Union troops. The combined Union armies of Ohio and Tennessee are driven back after briefly retaking Nashville, and Memphis remains out of reach for Northern forces, keeping the Western theater connected to the East. In the East, the Confederates succeed at Harper's Ferry, and unlike in real history, they do not lose their battle plans at an abandoned campsite.
With no intelligence windfall to save them, McClellan is crushed at Sharpsburg. The Union is forced into deeper retreat. Even with these victories, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia remains smaller than the massive Army of the Potomac guarding Washington. The Confederates have no realistic chance of storming the capital, the most heavily fortified point on Earth. Yet their triumphs allow Lee to push into western Maryland, gather supplies, and withdraw south before being trapped. The North reels. Troops from the western states are rushed eastward to reinforce Washington. Many begin questioning Lincoln's leadership openly. Copperhead Democrats, those pleading for peace, surge in influence. With Western forces reduced, Lincoln pressures Kentucky to raise an army against the Confederacy, quietly threatening to sever their covert trade with Tennessee. Kentuckians explode in outrage. Just as General Johnston begins his campaign there, Lincoln's heavy-handed decree backfires, and Kentucky declares for the Confederacy, backed by Southern arms. Still, the South faces major setbacks. The defeat at Glorietta Pass halts any dreams of expanding westward. Meanwhile, the fall of New Orleans threatens to slice the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi. Yet 1863 brings new hope. Stonewall Jackson survives Chancellorsville in this alternate timeline, allowing him to interpret Lee's orders clearly at Gettysburg and deliver a crushing blow to George Meade. Northern defenses crumble. Pressure intensifies as Lincoln is forced to move the government to Philadelphia.
The public's patience with the war and the Republican leadership reaches a breaking point. While the Union scores victories along the Mississippi, those distant triumphs do little to soothe a population that lives overwhelmingly along the East Coast. What happens near home matters more. By 1864, neither side achieves a decisive breakthrough. But the Confederacy makes a shocking policy shift, abandoning their absolute defense of slavery. A year earlier than in our timeline, they pass an emancipation bill aimed at reducing enslaved labor near unprotected families and boosting troop numbers, partly in response to Lincoln's own Emancipation Proclamation. The Union's inability to turn the tide destroys Lincoln politically. Within the Democratic Party, the Copperheads dominate, calling for peace. Lincoln's extensive suspension of habeas corpus and arrests of dissenters only strengthen their hand. Thomas H. Seymour, former governor of Connecticut, wins the Democratic nomination and narrowly defeats Lincoln in the 1864 election. With Seymour now in power, the North finally agrees to negotiate. During the winter of '64, the bloodshed ends. In this new world, Virginia remains whole, as the Unionist counties that historically formed West Virginia flee north to avoid retaliation. Missouri stays in the Union, while Arkansas and Indian Territory remain Confederate. Dixie even demands compensation for federal property seized during the war, much like the 1783 Treaty of Paris between the United States and Britain. The peace outrages many Northerners, who brand Seymour a traitor for ending the fight just as the North still had the strength to win, if only it had endured a few more brutal years. But this was always the only real path to Confederate independence: apply enough pressure, fracture Northern politics, bring down Lincoln, and negotiate a settlement. And just as Britain and America eventually became allies after their own bloody split, so too would the Union and Confederacy, two nations sharing a continent bound by rivalry, memory, and necessity. Before the war, much of the bitterness that marked the era after secession simply didn't exist. Northerners and Southerners still saw each other as sister states, tied together by trade, family networks, and a shared belief that they were the rightful heirs of the founding generation. In many ways, their relationship resembled the split between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Both claimed the true legacy of the original faith, both accused the other of drifting into heresy, and both used the founders' words to validate their own vision. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and even Jackson were admired across both nations, their monuments standing proudly from Boston to New Orleans. And for all their internal squabbles, whenever an outside power threatened one of the sisters, the other usually closed ranks without hesitation. One thing often overlooked about the actual Confederacy, however, is just how brutally its own government trampled the states' rights it claimed to protect. Davis and the Confederate Congress accumulated sweeping emergency powers, stripping away civil liberties and creating a centralized wartime machine that no one truly liked. The Confederacy, as it existed during the war, simply couldn't survive long-term. So, once peace came, a new constitutional convention, deliberately modeled on the one of 1787, was called to restructure the government. Despite earlier promises that they would never imitate the party madness of the old Union, two rival factions immediately emerged. On one side stood the Democratic Party, representing the plantation aristocracy and championing free trade and weak federal authority, all to ensure their personal dominance over the states. On the other side rose the Dixie Party, favoring a stronger central government, industrial growth, and an expansion of civil liberties for poor whites and newly freed black Southerners. The first major issue they tackled was slavery. In an ironic twist, the institution that had originally driven secession collapsed faster in this alternate timeline than many imagine. Instead of being federally protected, slavery was handed back to the states, with vague but deliberate language that made its gradual abolition all but certain. Diplomatic pressure from Britain accelerated the shift, as London continued to make its stance on emancipation unmistakably clear. History often forgets how close Jefferson Davis came to abolishing slavery in 1864 in exchange for French and British military aid, a desperate offer that came too late to matter.
But in this alternate path, Congress had already introduced emancipation back on March 13, 1865, granting freedom to enslaved men who served in the Confederate Army. It was the Confederacy's first legal step toward abolition, surprising many who assumed the South would cling to the institution forever. Once peace returned, many of the wartime proto-socialist economic systems, state-run industries, fixed prices, and nationalized salt, textile, and food production were dismantled. Dixie returned to its older model, and most of the seized assets were sold back to the wealthy families who had dominated antebellum politics anyway. The system, in effect, returned to the libertarian-leaning ideal of the original Montgomery Convention, though now tempered with stronger federal oversight. The infamous three-state veto, where any trio of state legislatures could reject federal laws and force Congress to repass them with a two-thirds majority, was weakened. It now required 5 states instead of 3, still protecting state autonomy, but giving the federal government needed breathing room. An interstate commerce clause, practically non-existent in the original Confederate Constitution, was finally strengthened. Its absence had caused chaos during the war. In this new system, Richmond gained the authority to fund infrastructure, railroads, canals, and major roadways, though states still kept near total control of their internal economies. English was officially declared the national language, partly to clamp down on pro-Union German communities in Texas, many of whom had openly resisted the Confederacy by forming militias. Of course, this is only a glimpse of the likely constitutional changes. Comment your own additions below because the rewriting of Confederate law would have sparked endless local debates. South Carolina, the first state to secede, was infuriated by these changes. To them, it looked as though their sacrifice had been wasted, and the new government wasn't nearly radical enough. They dragged their feet on ratification, echoing Rhode Island's hesitation in 1787. Choosing the first president under this new constitution was far from straightforward. Davis had amassed legions of enemies, and despite the new system, no one wanted him back. His vice president, Alexander Stephens, was equally distrusted, respected by few and disliked by many. The public's attention turned toward the military. Lee seemed like the natural successor, but his declining health and his lukewarm passion for Confederate nationalism made him unwilling. His loyalty was always more to Virginia than to Richmond. Albert Sidney Johnston, the other major figure, was also in poor health. That left P.G.T. Beauregard as the highest-ranking viable general. And Beauregard came with contradictions emblematic of the whole Confederacy. A Creole Catholic from New Orleans, later a civil rights advocate in real life, yet a fiercely loyal Confederate commander, he embodied a South far more complicated than stereotypes allow. Clever, charismatic, and adored by his troops, Beauregard had spent the war cultivating a powerful public image. He learned quickly how to work with newspapers, gathering support among poor whites and newly emancipated black Southerners who trusted him. His populist campaign, paired with Zebulon Vance as his vice president, a states' rights advocate and vocal Davis critic, built a coalition strong enough to challenge the old elite. Unlike Washington's unanimous election, this one was fiercely contested. Beauregard narrowly defeated Joseph E. Brown, the governor of Georgia, and once in power, Confederates quickly rewrote their narrative. Beauregard's image was elevated, transformed into a Southern George Washington, overshadowing even Lee, who was reframed as merely his greatest lieutenant. Davis, meanwhile, was pushed into the background of memory, much like the presidents of the Continental Congress are mostly forgotten today. For the old aristocracy, things only got worse. Beauregard and Vance, both relatively progressive for their time, stripped away the last remnants of oligarchic control. Federal power expanded, modernization surged, and Southern capital was encouraged, or pushed, to flow into factories rather than plantations. Railroads stretched across Dixie, industry blossomed, and as slavery faded, the South's social order was irreversibly transformed. In this alternate legacy, the Confederacy crafted its own version of American history. The war would not be called a civil war, but the War of Northern Aggression or the Second American Revolution. Northerners, in turn, would dismiss it as a rebellion. The Baltimore riots, where pro-Southern mobs were shot by Massachusetts troops, became the South's equivalent of the Boston Massacre. Southerners claimed ownership of the American Revolution itself. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Patrick Henry, Francis Marion, and many other icons were Southerners, and, in their view, the Confederacy had inherited the mantle of 1776, while the Union had abandoned it. In this alternate Confederacy, July 4th remained a national holiday, yet Southern history books told the story very differently. To them, Northern figures like Hamilton, John Jay, and John Adams had twisted the American project into something subservient to Northern merchants and, by extension, the British financial sphere. In their narrative, Madison's Virginia plan had been hijacked during the Constitutional Convention, conveniently held in Philadelphia, enemy territory. Just as Southerners claimed the Revolution was fought largely by their own ancestors, they argued that the War of 1812 had been carried almost entirely on Southern shoulders. Had it not been for treacherous Northern militias refusing to fight out of sympathy for Britain, the South insisted they would have won a decisive victory. The same logic carried over into the Mexican-American War. In their telling, the Confederacy had delivered that triumph. James K. Polk was a Tennessean. Most leading officers, Scott, Taylor, Johnston, Beauregard, Jackson, Lee, were Southerners. Without their leadership, they claimed, Northern cowards like Lincoln, who had denounced the war, would have let Texas slip back into Mexican hands.
All of this fed into a dangerous myth, that the South had never truly been defeated, and that its racial hierarchy reflected some imagined lineage, that Southern English settlers descended from Norman conquerors, while Northerners were the descendants of submissive Anglo-Saxons. It was pseudo-history, but it circulated widely enough that many Confederates believed it. If you doubt it, read Look Away by William C. Davis. These ideas were genuinely discussed. Yet Southern culture evolved dramatically after the war. Citizens still identified first with their states, but a new Dixie identity emerged, part pride, part resentment, part mythology. Efforts to purge so-called Yankeeisms continued. Southern spelling drifted slightly from Northern norms, accents thickened, and cultural lines hardened. Northerners called them Dixies, while Southerners called them Yankees, but both still referred to their homelands collectively as America. Abroad, a Southerner would likely introduce himself as a Virginia American or Carolina American, while a Northerner simply said American. To foreigners, the two nations were known clearly, USA in the north, CSA in the south. But naming the citizens themselves remained awkward. Northern Americans and Southern Americans sounded too much like North and South America, confusing everyone. If you have better naming ideas, drop them in the comments. As mentioned earlier, the CSA eventually secured an agreement with Britain for a gradual abolition of slavery. However, the sheer size of the black population, around 45% in 1860, terrified many white Southerners who dreamt of maintaining a pure white society. So the government built a naval force dedicated solely to deportation to Liberia. Removing 4 million people was an enormous undertaking, but with emancipation staggered over decades, the Confederacy managed it in small annual waves. By the 1890s, over 90% of formerly enslaved people had been relocated. Those who remained were the veterans who had fought for the Confederacy and their families. To many modern observers, Confederate leaders seem foolish, men who would drive the South into ruin. And while many were undeniably racist, they were hardly uneducated. They attended the same institutions as the Northern elite, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Virginia, and they were often economically shrewd. As cotton's dominance declined and Britain opened new markets in India and Egypt, the South recognized slavery's collapse was inevitable. Industrialization accelerated, fueled by European immigration and proximity to the booming northern economy across the Ohio River. The South could not avoid following a similar path. Class divisions became sharper. Blacks had been at the very bottom, with poor whites just above them, then small landowners, and finally the entrenched plantation dynasties at the top. But after mass deportations removed the bottom rung, poor whites quickly accumulated political power in the Dixie Party. Meanwhile, the oligarchs, blamed for causing the war, steadily lost influence as the central government grew stronger. Alexis de Tocqueville's predictions in Democracy in America rang true. When elites become hated by the masses, democracy tends to flatten hierarchies. In the North, the federal government remained in Philadelphia, the original capital. Washington, D.C., perched near the border, was too exposed after the war to remain politically viable. As the old generals returned home and soldiers reintegrated, both major parties deteriorated. Democrats were condemned for ending the war. Republicans were criticized for Lincoln's disastrous leadership and the antagonism that prolonged the conflict. Both parties collapsed. Northern Democrats rebranded as Unionists, abandoning the Democrat name, which had become synonymous with Southern rebellion, but keeping many of the same positions: states' rights, limited federal power, pro-agriculture, and suspicion toward heavy industry. Across the aisle, Republicans merged with the remnants of the Whigs and revived the Federalist Party name, a symbolic return to the founding era. Led by radicals like Fremont, Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and William H. Seward, they advocated high tariffs, federal assumption of state debts, the Transcontinental Railroad, a powerful national bank, and a revival of Henry Clay's American system. Seward, a fierce abolitionist and Lincoln's wartime Secretary of State, defeated Seymour in the 1868 election. His campaign was aggressive, painting Seymour as the man who betrayed the Union in the peace settlement. Under Seward, Northern expansion fever surged. He completed his historic purchase of Alaska and succeeded where Johnson had failed by acquiring Greenland and Iceland from Denmark, a deal that nearly happened in real history. Despite losing the war, the Union's economy survived largely intact. Its relationship with the South, though complicated, remained economically symbiotic. Without the political drag of Southern veto power, Northern industrial capitalism exploded even faster, igniting an even more powerful Gilded Age. Reconstruction costs didn't exist, and with less than 2% of the population being black, integration challenges were minimal. Federalists quickly secured equal rights for the Northern black population, and racial tensions were significantly lower than in our timeline. Mexico, unexpectedly, emerged as one of the biggest winners. The Second Mexican Empire under Maximilian survived. The Union was too occupied rebuilding to covertly support the liberal opposition, and the French client state stabilized. The Confederacy and Mexico developed strong ties, not because of the Golden Circle conspiracy, a fringe fantasy, but because both had long-standing cultural and diplomatic connections to France. With the collapse of French control after the Franco-Prussian War, Mexico modernized rapidly. Its proximity to both the CSA and the Union created economic momentum. Catholic immigrants from France, Germany, Spain, and Italy poured in, helping Mexico develop alongside the North and South, and preventing extremist groups or cartels from emerging later. Spain also benefited. Though many Southerners once dreamed of acquiring Cuba, Confederate expansionism evaporated once mass deportations began. Instead, they focused on developing the vast territories they already possessed. Thus, when Cuba revolted in 1895, the Confederacy supported Spain, offering material aid and private volunteers in exchange for trade privileges. Spain crushed the rebellion, retaining control of its richest Caribbean province. Cuba, no longer technically a colony, nevertheless remained tied to Madrid, giving Spain funds and stability during its last decades as an imperial power. Despite all this alternate development, Europe remained largely unchanged. The North rose as a global economic titan. Both American nations attracted heavy European immigration, and continental politics continued without dramatic upheaval. And the Confederacy itself? Over time, its original ideology faded. Slavery vanished. States' rights were repeatedly curtailed. Even the vaunted concept of pure Southern blood dissolved as millions of European immigrants settled in search of opportunity. Yet, the South held fiercely to its self-image, its music, its mythology, its pride, its sense of separation. In this alternate story, the South finally became what many of its early dreamers imagined, a nation that preserved its cultural soul without Northern interference. Dixie, at last, was free.